to devalue their currency, Bitcoin wins. In the world of fiat currencies, Bitcoin is the victor.
I mean, that's part of the bull case for Bitcoin.
If you're not paying attention, you probably should be.
Mike Brock, what is and what ought to be?
We're starting off with a philosophy already.
We're getting right into it.
What is and what ought to be. Well, I mean, that's a complex question. What is and what is not to be. I think you're obviously referring to my my delving into Hume on Twitter in this conversation around natural law. The conversation I was having on Twitter, I guess with some folks from, I guess, the Mises Institute in Australia or something, was really just around this idea that natural law can't get around the is-ought problem. There's a Hume, David Hume, had a conjecture that you cannot get from an is statement to an ought statement. There are is statements in the world, like the sky is blue, I am a human, oxygen is in the atmosphere, like all these things that we can just sort of like take stock of. There's this giant set of things that is. And Hume said, as many as is statements as you pile up about, like, the world around you and the things that you know and the set of knowledge, you can't actually take that and derive an ought statement from it. You can't get from, an elephant is an animal, an elephant, is, a plant eater to, an elephant, ought, to be given a right. Like, you can't get there in Hume. So Hume sort of, took the sort of stick and beat the Aristotelian view over the head, which is that, you can't derive purpose from is. And that's kind of the big sort of, like idea around the is-ought problem. And so therefore, the argument is you can't really derive natural law purely rationally, which leads to a big split in sort of the view around ethics and morality. And this represents like a big sort of, there's a space within sort of political philosophy of those who believe that you can, which Murray Rothbard and Hoppe and Walter Block and a bunch of libertarian scholars believe that you can. That's like sort of I guess like the Rothbardian school, and then there's a whole other school of thought. On the other hand, like F.A. Hayek, for example, like did not agree with that. Neither did Mises, by the way. Mises didn't accept Rothbard's natural law theory. And so there's actually like sort of this really weirdly unknown sort of like schism in sort of how to build up like morality and ethics, even within sort of libertarianism. And that was kind of what I was getting at.
Yeah, Rothbard thought Mises was a socialist, which is hilarious.
I don't agree with that. And Hoppe thought Milton Friedman was like a flaming ultra left socialist too, which seems crazy on its face.
It's funny diving into this stuff because I studied economics and I didn't major in philosophy, but used all my electives on philosophy in college and after. It wasn't until after college and I dove into currency markets and stuff that I started learning about like the Austrian school and the fights within the Austrian school. You had Rothbard versus Mises versus Hayek, and they all have differing opinions and philosophies and I guess first principles types of thinking for these grand ideas. But I think at the end of the day, they all have a very similar aim, which is to empower the individual to basically make the world a better place, which is why we're here to talk. I think all three of us, Matthew, myself, and you, Mike, believe that Bitcoin is a very good tool for the individual in the digital age. Is that a correct assessment?
Absolutely. I mean, I think it's one of the most exciting technologies for many different reasons. I have, we can relate back to this conversation around how I may have a little bit of differences on why I think Bitcoin is so important, to our future. But I think that it is a very important, technological, social, and cultural development that I think addresses a whole series of problems, not just money, but also, the more broadly, the concentration of power, like attached to money. And I think that it's I mean, to me, I think it might actually be like the one thing that I look at today that gives me sort of hope that we can sort of push back against some of these really what I would say are asymmetric risks to the continuation of human freedom around the world. And it's not just like, I'm not, and it's not just like the Federal Reserve printing money. It's also about like the concentration of power in authoritarian countries and the use of, the weaponization of the internet to engage in mass surveillance, to control, to influence people, like this sort of scary emergence of using artificial intelligence and machine learning to mass manipulate populations through like extremely like scary like levels of propaganda. And I think Bitcoin sort of like kind of touches on all these things in very interesting ways. And I think it is a hopeful technology. That's what I'll say.
Yeah, most certainly a hopeful technology. And for any of you freaks out there, like, who the hell is this guy? Who are we talking? We're talking to Mike Brock from, is it correct? So you're the product lead at tbDEX?
I'm already skipped that spot.
Yeah, so tbD is a business unit at Square. It is one of our 4 business units. I just said Square. I'm sorry. We are now Block. It is force of habit been working at the company for over 8 years, so it's hard to change that. So we are one of the 4 business units at Block. The others being Cash App, Square, and Tidal. And so we are a fully like independent business unit within the organization that is working on this technology that we're talking about today, like tbDEX, but more broadly, building out financial infrastructure for this decentralized world. And we could talk a little bit about that too, and sort of how we're thinking about that in the future, and how, tbDEX is sort of our first major project, sort of plays into maybe a longer term vision of what we see we can do to make the world a better place.
Yeah, I definitely want to get into that, but I think it's important to set the stage for your involvement personally at Block, Cash App, and Square before that, and how you got to where you are leading the tbDEX initiative within Block, because I don't think people understand the amount of influence you've had on Block as a company and its as sub-companies over the course of its life.
Yeah, I mean, I've been at the company, like as I said, for over 8 years. It's the longest place I've ever worked at. I'm sure it's a place I've worked at the longest, more than any other job. And I've worked on some things over the years. When I joined Square, we were about little more than 300 employees globally, and today we're like 8,000. So it's been quite a ride to take a company from that small and help build it to this level. I joined the company originally directly onto what is now known as Cash App. I was, in the first dozen or so employees that assembled together to create this really crazy idea for a P2P payment product that ultimately became the sort of the Venmo competitor at Square, and then ultimately with its trajectory, we sort of became the number 1 consumer financial P2P app in the United States. And so I was definitely very involved in a lot of the initiatives that led us there. I worked on our instant settlement product within Cash App that ultimately was our one of our major differentiating features in the initial years. The idea that you could get payment, or you could cash out your payment directly to your bank account instantaneously. I worked on our consumer banking strategy, which encompasses the Cash Card program, and then sort of I guess my third major act was Bitcoin in 2017. I worked very closely with Jack and a few other members of the team on a Hack Week project to bring Bitcoin into Cash App in January of 2017. The initial idea for that was actually quite simple, nothing like we have today. Jack wanted to buy a coffee from Blue Bottle with Bitcoin, and he wanted to be able to do that, within the by the end of the Hack Week, which we sort of accomplished. The Hack Week only lasted until Friday. We didn't get it working until the next Monday, so technically we cheated a little bit. But we got it working. We were able to add a wallet into Cash App, and we were able to load funds into that wallet, and we were able to build, a feature that automatically converted that Bitcoin back into dollars to fund the actual card transaction. And so that was the first time I had ever even touched Bitcoin. I didn't know anything about it, honestly, even before that. I knew of it. I knew nothing about its technical implementation. So we really had to learn on the fly, and we built that in a week. And in a sense, the rest is kind of history. Ever since that moment, I've sort of had my hands in pretty much everything we've done at the company to do with Bitcoin. I was responsible for setting up Square Crypto, now Spiral. I led all the interviews to figure out who was going to come in and lead it, and ultimately I went with Steve Lee.
Great choice.
And now now today I'm running our newest business unit, which is focused completely on this set of technologies. So that's kind of the high level overview, because I don't want to spend 30 minutes doing a biography, but I think that's a pretty good big bullet points of my contributions to Square.
I do want to get into the man behind tbDEX and all these things at Square, like the Hack Week specifically. Like I'm surprised that was like the first time you interacted with Bitcoin. Like, what stuck out to you during that about the protocol and attempting to implement it into what you guys are doing at Square?
Yeah, I mean, this is where I just have to kind of give Jack a lot of credit here. Jack actually told this story at the Consensus conference in 2018, up on stage with Elizabeth Stark. So it has been told before, and it's not apocryphal. He actually had to work quite hard to convince me to even look at it, right? Like he came to me on a Monday, the Monday of the Hack Week, I think, and said, I want to do a Hack Week project with you, and I want to do Bitcoin. And I actually told him no, I didn't want to do that. I wasn't interested in doing Bitcoin. I also wasn't even going to participate in the Hack Week at all. I was very focused at that time on getting Cash Card out the door. And so I was working on that, and we were several months away from being able to launch that. He sort of camped out at my desk for the entire day and told me that he wasn't going to leave until I agreed to do Bitcoin. And I finally broke down on the morning on Tuesday and agreed to do it. So he kind of deserves all the credit for pushing me into it. I can't tell a story that I was somehow enlightened or anything like that. I was actually, if anything, I was kind of what the hell is this? I don't understand how this matters. I don't know why we would do this. This is crazy. I obviously don't think that anymore, but at the time it was kind of really pushed on me. And I'm glad he did. I'm glad, Jack sort of, he's really good at looking around corners and, seeing out into the future and where things are going. And he had this really strong belief at the time that Bitcoin was going to matter in a big way. And he sort of pulled me into it. I'm grateful he did.
Yeah.
So that happened in 2017. At what point in 2017 was that Hack Week?
January, very beginning, right after the year. We like this was like that was the other thing too. This was all kind of happening in the sort of the hangover of the election in 2016, which had happened obviously just weeks earlier. Everyone had kind of come back, and everyone was sort of like, "What happened?" Like, obviously the world didn't feel the same anymore, and so yeah, that was right then, right in the middle of all that.
And then,
morass.
What was the public launch of Bitcoin on Cash App?
Yeah, so we launched the beta to a whole bunch of customers by fall of that year, and then we didn't go into general release until early 2018.
Gotcha.
I don't remember the exact date, but we members of the public were using it by, I think, around Thanksgiving of 2017.
Yeah, I definitely have some December 2017 buys on Cash App that I can go check. I think that's when I started using the app. No, it's nice to know that Jack's like a typical Bitcoiner. He just pesters people, teases them into getting into it until they finally relent. But yeah, I mean, I'm thankful that he did. Number one, because Cash App, disclaimer, sponsor of the podcast. I mean, it's just one of the easiest ways to get people in. Like, go to Cash App. Millions of people already have it. The UX is impeccable. And you guys are really leaning into Bitcoin, specifically giving it front and center real estate. Regardless, I mean, we're definitely going to get into this conversation. Regardless of what you think of KYC AML from a branding and just sort of pushing Bitcoin into the public sphere and pop culture specifically, especially with the partnerships you guys do with people like Meg the Stallion. I think Gwyneth Paltrow's on the team now. Max Verstappen, Cash App, Block in general has done an incredible job of really bringing Bitcoin to the fore of the public conversation via your products. And it's just been incredible to see a company, the stature of Block, step in and put your neck out like this on behalf of Bitcoin. And like you said, it's probably a testament to Jack's vision, but getting everybody on board and implementing it into all your products has just been extremely impressive. And like Matt said, going from that hack day in the beginning of 2017, having it rolled out by the end of the year, and now seeing what you guys have done in 3 years.
Yeah, I mean that's actually kind of the more interesting story, right? Is how did we, as a publicly traded company, in 2017, go from having nothing to do with it? I mean, Bitcoin in 2017 was still like very. It wasn't the mainstream thing that it is today. You turn on CNBC today and there's a Bitcoin ticker in the bottom right-hand corner like all day now, which is like, wow. But like that wasn't a thing back then. And it wasn't even clear to me when we decided that we were going to go for it, that we were going to develop this and launch it to the public, that we were going to be able to get through all the regulatory hurdles and convince our partners within our value chain to kind of go along with it. There was an intense amount of skepticism about doing it, not just from me. I had that skepticism at the beginning, but even after I sort of like agreed to do it, I then had to turn around and kind of go to war against some of the most intense skepticism that I've ever experienced in my professional life. Both inside the company and outside the company. I think it's a really it's actually kind of a really interesting story how we did that. It probably would take up 2 or 3 hours to fully tell it, but it was certainly filled with lots of drama and twists and turns of like how we actually were able to break through the barriers that stood in the way of us actually being able to turn the switch on.
We don't have to get into the 2 to 3 hour story, but what were like the biggest hurdles? Was it like treating Bitcoin the asset, like custody, just how to define it on the balance sheet, stuff like that, or? So there was a lot of that, right? Obviously, like how do we do revenue recognition? What's the balance sheet treatment? Those were that a lot of that though kind of came very late in the game. In terms of like, finally, we're actually going to do this, and this is going to be part of our quarterly earnings, and we're actually going to have to talk about it, and the SEC is going to have to be okay with it.
That actually was very, very late in the game, and that obviously was still, a lot of stressful, late nights and like hours long meetings, going through, theories of the case on the accounting treatment and stuff. But a lot of it was the really was just the fact that nobody wanted to touch Bitcoin with 1,000-foot pole, in the traditional financial system, right? You walk in and you walk into a bank and you say hey, we need a bank account, and they're like, what for? And it's, well, we're going to be trading Bitcoin to and from it. And they're like, what are you talking about? Are you kidding me? No, absolutely not. Right? That was kind of we understand you're Square and you're this big company, but we'd rather not do that. So go somewhere else. That was probably the, I don't want to get too far into specifics of who and what and how. Obviously there's non-disclosure agreements and such that have to be respected, but there was just massive skepticism throughout the entire fight. It honestly, you don't really have to talk about NDAs really, because it was really just everyone, 100% people in the financial system were just not cool with it. And that was part of the big hurdles that we had to jump over and really fight to get people comfortable with the idea of doing it.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, again, thank you for doing it. A company of block stature doing this is, I think, massive cultural point in history for Bitcoin. Again, having the chutzpah to put your balls on the line and stand up for this and fight through all that adversity, I think will be looked back upon as somebody had to do it first, and it seems like you guys were one of the first, which will be a cool historical sticking point. The first sort of external Bitcoin company.
It's going to sound like I'm kissing Jack's butt again, but he deserves so much of the credit because Jack knows I have no problem disagreeing with him when I disagree with him. But he really had to hold the line too, because there was the skepticism was as much in his direction as it was mine. What are you doing? Why would you take the company in this direction? This is going to ruin our reputation. And he had to really fight back against that and really sort of hold the line. And it took a lot of, I think, bravery on Jack's part to provide the space that was needed to actually get it done.
Yeah, and this provides a great transition to talking about tbDEX, because I'm sure the headaches are only going to get larger from here with what you're trying to accomplish with the how would you describe it? It's an open protocol, right? Again, I reread. I didn't write it. The white paper today, and I think let's dive into tbDEX. Number one, why, and then we'll get into the how, because there's many parties. You have DID, decentralized identity. You have PFIs, participating financial institutions. You have VCs, which is funny, considering the last few weeks. About VCs are I just forgot, verified credentials as well. So there's many variables that come into play with this protocol. First, let's get to the why of tbDEX. How did it come to be? Why are you building it? And then we'll get into the specifics of how it actually works.
Yeah, the way that I would sort of maybe preface everything I'm about to say, and to sort of just maybe establish my thinking and how we approached it, is that I just believe that if you want to change the world, if you want to bring about systemic change, whatever it is, in culture and politics and business and technology, you have to accept where you are. Where are you standing? What are the limitations that I'm working with right now? You can't build a rocket ship if rocket fuel hasn't been invented, right? There's you have to sort of put put all the sort of pieces on the table and say, this is what I'm working with right now. And there's a gap between the capabilities that I want to exist in the future to support this vision, and the sort of the tools that are in my toolbox. And I think that I really, and I've tried to do that my whole career. In my travails at Square, I always try to start from a very intellectually honest, starting point, and then work towards that future. And so it was within that frame that we really started to explore this idea of like, okay, well, how can we make Bitcoin and decentralized financial services more generally more accessible? And the big thing that just I kept coming back to, and this is something that I'd been obsessing over since we started working on Bitcoin in 2017, was that there's sort of this really kind of fatal conceit almost at the sort of the center of the user experience of Bitcoin, which isn't Bitcoin's problem. I mean, Bitcoin does a really good job at solving the problem it's trying to solve, but the reality is that most of us, almost all of us, we still have to transact in fiat currency and in the traditional financial system with using the traditional payment system, subject to the rules and the regulations and the limitations of that system. And there's just kind of really no way to sort of just like pack up and move to this new world in a wholesale way, because there's just real network effects there, right? Like the consequences. I mean, you could do it, I suppose, but you would have to accept like very significant limitations on your daily life,
or move to El Salvador.
Yeah, or move to El Salvador. And so I looking at this, I just asked myself, like, well, what are the things that we can do to accelerate our progress towards that future, taking into account like where we are today? And I really always just kind of kept coming back to this idea of like on-ramps and off-ramps, right? That, the more slippery the pipes to Bitcoin and from Bitcoin are, then, that has, we can kind of go back to philosophy and economics a little bit, but like, just like, the argument there is like the more sort of liquidity that there are between, markets, markets of fiat and markets of Bitcoin, the more easy it will be to adopt, the less pricing risk, the less counterparty risk, all these things that would like ultimately reduce transaction costs, and then ultimately, start to like change the equilibrium between the trade-offs of Bitcoin, whatever it is, like pricing volatility, transaction costs, the time spent, like going into an exchange and like getting money in and getting money out with like all these really crappy payment systems like ACH, and just trying to like find a way to abstract that all away in a way that like makes that liquidity bridge as slippery as possible. And so I've just kind of obsessed with this idea for a long time. And when I looked at Bitcoin and I asked myself, okay, well, I'm a big, supporter of like the Lightning project and the work that they're doing to, scale Bitcoin payments. It's a very, I think it's very exciting, and I feel it's really started to come into its own in the last year. But I think it still doesn't really address this problem, right? Of like trying to like get people, to pick up and move to this new system. And I think if we're going to do that, then we have to like be really honest with ourselves. The biggest layer 2 protocol for Bitcoin today are exchanges. I mean, that's just true, right? Like, I know people might cringe at me saying that, but like, Cash App and Coinbase and Gemini and these companies, they're essentially like centralized layer 2 protocols for, for these systems. And as long as that's true, there's actually kind of really, I think the incentive structures to long-term adoption have significant problems. And so, that obviously doesn't change the fact that the payment system is still regulated, it's still shitty, it's still slow. But, I looked into my toolbox of, the last 8 years of working at a company that operates in traditional financial services. And I asked myself, like, well, can we do this better? We know a lot about payments. We know a lot about managing risk in payments. We know a lot about regulatory compliance and how to deal with that, and how to attenuate the impact on customer experience. Can we take that? Can we abstract that away? Can we find a way to maybe even commoditize that? And this is sort of like, this is sort of the progression that kind of gets you to this like idea that starts to become tbDEX. And so tbDEX, I think, like at the end of the day, is a very like just intellectually honest take on like where we are, and like and where we need to be, and it solves a problem that's very specific to that context. And so there's this reaction that people have when they say, well, why is it not a trustless system? Well, it's very simple, because tautologically speaking, fiat's not a trustless system. And if you're exchanging crypto for fiat, both sides of that transaction have to be trustless for the exchange mechanism to be trustless. And so by one side of that not being trustless, it's tautologically true. There's that word again, we talk about tautologies, that the system it can't be trustless. So we look at this and we say, okay, well, like we can't solve that technologically. There's no real way around the fact that the payment system is not. You can't do an atomic swap with a bank account. You can't do an atomic swap with like a Visa or a MasterCard. There's no way to do this. In fact, reversibility of payments is built in as a feature of these systems. And so there's no fighting against that. Like you can try all you want and you'll get nowhere. And so what we say is, well, how do we really solve this problem? Well, how are we solving this problem today? And can that be abstracted into something that's at least more open and more decentralized? And the big idea is that, well, the way we solve it is through these webs of social trust in the real world. We have social trust with Cash App, or we have social trust with Coinbase that they will do the right thing, that they won't just keep our money and not give us Bitcoin, that they will like make good on mistakes, that they will be accountable for the performance of the services that they promise to perform contractually. And that's a system of social trust, and we take it for granted. And so the tbDEX protocol kind of looks at that and says, well, what if we can look at technologies like decentralized identity and verifiable credentials? What if we can model that social trust, maybe not in a purely trustless way, because we've already established that seems to be tautologically impossible, but then at least build a way in which people can, in a far more decentralized way, build up these networks of trust to accomplish the same thing, to be able to interact with these, these systems that have these impedance mismatches, and at least build something that can long-term drive down risk, drive down cost, and can universalize and commoditize the exchange markets between fiat and crypto. That's basically the general idea. And I think it's one that's just very, steeped in just like, reality, and just like the fact that like, I can't fix fiat. We think crypto fixes fiat, or Bitcoin fixes fiat. But if that's true, we still need to get people there. There has to be a train that they can catch. And I think that's what we're trying to build with tbDEX.
Yeah. Many thoughts after that eloquent description of what you're doing. Number one, it's very Humean of you to say Bitcoin is this way at the second layer, and it should be this way. Maybe it ought to be this way. Just an observation. Number two, I do like... So is it a correct assessment to essentially say that you're trying to not realign incentives, but change the incentives between the individual and a trusted third party by maybe leveling the playing field and having some of these trusted third parties act in ways which is more beneficial to the end user?
I think that's a really great way of putting it. I don't think I would quibble with that.
Yeah. And so how do we get here? I guess let's get into like the mechanics of it. How does this? So essentially, the way I understand it is a messaging protocol that is interoperable, that free and open source wallet softwares can plug into, as well as these trusted third parties with varying degrees of necessary credentials on the end user's parts.
Yeah, I think there's a few subtle, like the obvious criticism that is the first one. It's the first one that occurred to me because I try to be introspective and self-critical, in my own ideas. Is that why would anyone adopt this, right? Why would a bank adopt this? Why would any traditional financial service adopt this system? It seems very counter to their business goals. It seems very counter to the general trend of wanting to kind of keep people inside walled gardens and not actually commoditize on ramps and off ramps. That's actually kind of the that's actually the thing that a lot of services typically don't want to do. They want you to set up shop inside their ecosystem, and they want to make it very hard to leave. And a protocol like tbDEX would appear to be a shot across the bow of that. And to bury the lead, it is, but I think it ignores a few fundamental things, right? Which is that, I think I think consumer choice is a very powerful force, and two, and this is just very true of any market. There are a lot of incumbents in any market that stand to lose a lot, if their business models are disrupted. But there's also a lot of non-incumbents that stand to gain a lot from new models of business and new ways of doing things. And we see this with fintechs like Block, and other companies that are in the space, are investing in the Bitcoin ecosystem and open systems. You see it even outside fintech, right? I used to work at Red Hat, which is a open source software company now owned by IBM. But they have found business models around building things that they give away for free, and they sell services and support and professional services to monetize that public good that they're investing in. And those models have actually been wildly successful. I mean, we're talking on the internet right now. The amount of open source software that's standing between my voice and yours right now is insane, right? Everything from, the web protocols to almost certainly the Linux servers that this is running on, and all the open source middleware and software packages that have been sort of compiled into the source code. Open source is one of the most wildly successful technological inventions in history. And I think a lot of people, it's sort of invisible to a lot of people, but if you sit back and think about it, the degree to which it's changed the world and has benefited so many, including us right now, is amazing. And I look at, say, something like tbDEX and the fact that, yes, it challenges existing business models, but it also creates new ones. And there's a lot of folks out there that, like fintechs, crypto companies that look at, say, something like this, and they actually see, wow, on top of this, we can build an entirely new ecosystem of, financial services and other types of services that create business models that didn't exist before. And so the tbDEX model is very optimistic and looks at that and says that, I think that there's many other people out there that will believe in this future and will come and help us build it. And that's actually largely borne out, actually. Since we launched the white paper, we've had amazing conversations with some really, really large players, maybe some even unexpected ones that are you know what, actually, this is great. We would really like to pay less money for payments, accepting payments or sending payments or not being held captive to, these existing systems, which are terrible, and we lose lots of money on fraud, and the payment system's unreliable, and what you find with these things is there's always people that have something to gain, and so I think that that I'm very optimistic that despite the fact that tbDEX is so disruptive in the sense that it's of these business models at its core, I think there's enough hungry people out there willing to embrace this change because they recognize that there's other aspects of their business that would greatly benefit from that.
We actually talk about this phenomenon like all the time on the show because we see it firsthand in Bitcoin all the time because Bitcoin is this, open monetary network. And you usually see challengers are the ones who will move rather than the leaders in the space. The challengers will be the ones who move into these open networks, these open protocols first. You see that with El Salvador, right? The US government didn't do it first. El Salvador did, a tiny little country. You see it with MicroStrategy doing it, a small tech company that no one had really heard of. And then they decided to make the first move into Bitcoin. You see it with Cash App versus PayPal. And then what happens? What happens is on a long enough time scale, the challengers come in, they embrace this open network, this open protocol, and then the previous incumbents, the leaders in the field, they have no choice but to embrace it. Otherwise, they're going to get left behind.
Well, it's not only embracing it too, right? It's a classic Luddite dilemma, if you will. Like, if you do embrace it, and then you can build on top of it, leveraging its native properties to build new tools and experiences and applications that were never previously possible, which is just like hard. Like again, that's why I'm very thankful for what you guys have done at Block, is just sort of forcing it on the culture. Like, hey, it's here. We're going to start building on it. And it's just very exciting. And I'm very excited to see tbDEX come to market because I think, like you said, it is imperative to get people access to this stuff, like the on-ramps. So like, I love the way you described it because it's another thing that we say a lot on this show, especially comparing Bitcoin to other cryptocurrencies. Me personally, I just believe that I believe there is some cool things going on in alternative blockchains. However, I think you didn't say it exactly, but I think what you were describing is there's an order of operations to all this, and you're focused on one of the first operations was actually getting people onboarded in a somewhat seamless fashion.
Yeah, I think the onboarding problem is like the great unsolved issue in this space. Like, and I think there's a lot of it. Like, I think there's a lot of people who have their heads in the sand. When I launched this, or like, people would come to me and say, "What are you talking about? This is all solved. Like, look at this app I have on my phone. It does all the things." And I'm like, okay, well, like, go and pay your taxes then, or go and buy a coffee at Starbucks. And they're like, well, what do you mean? Like, and it's just like the ignorance of like sort of the average person's experience is like, I think really holding a lot of the community back. And by the way, I'm not saying that there shouldn't be an element of the community who are purists. They're the ones that are sort of like, driving things forward, driving Bitcoin forward, like, and building it to like what it is, and they deserve all the credit in the world. But there is a reality that, like, at a higher level, that we have to build experiences for people that solve real problems, and we all believe that Bitcoin solves these problems. But there's the reality that onboarding into it today from a neophyte perspective is very, very hard, and it's not the sort of thing that like somebody who isn't like technically inclined or isn't like very, very motivated for some sort of exigent reason to like actually jump through all the hurdles of like learning all of these like particularities around it. And as a product development guy, I look at this and I say, like, look, this is where I have to focus. I have to find a way to bridge that usability gap. And I'm trying to do it in a way that's like actually like as pure as possible. Like we said when we launched this on day one, that our guiding principle is decentralization. Decentralized as possible with everything we do. We ask ourselves a question now as we're starting to build out the roadmap for tbD, like, is this decentralized? Does this advance decentralization, or does it have perverse incentives that could lead to centralization long term? And so we're still trying to like hold true to that. We're not trying to use usability as a crutch to justify centralization, which I think a lot of that has happened. It's even happened, I guess, like, I can take the blame, right? We built a custodial system, right, in Cash App because it was the way to build the most user-friendly experience. But like, it doesn't change. It doesn't change the fact that making it as easy in a decentralized way is very, very hard. And we've said with tbD, and starting with tbDEX, we're going to start doing the things that hopefully can bring a decentralized experience to parity with the ease of use of centralized experiences. And that's sort of where I think we need to focus very, very heavily. And that's how we will truly unleash the potential of Bitcoin. That's my thesis.
What I keep thinking about is, and I really appreciate your guys' focus on this, is that you're trying to actually tackle that US dollar euro interaction, right? Because that is where the difficult question lies, which is how to interact with this trusted system that is actually very antiquated in a lot of ways. That's the hard part. And the elephant in the room right now is, when you're talking about decentralized exchanges, is something like Uniswap, right? And what did they do? They just threw out that aspect. They were like, we are not even going to bother trying to tackle going on and off between crypto and fiat into the banking system. We're just going to say, someone else figure that out. You can use fiat stable coins, you can use these peg tokens, and it could have been just as easy for you guys to do that. But the reality is that the hard problem here, the problem that would be really great if it got mitigated, if it got became less friction there and more competition there, is actually the interaction with the traditional banking system. And you guys seem to be tackling that head on. So I do appreciate that.
Yeah, and I do want to admit, I do want to say up front too, on the issue of stablecoins, is I do think that they are a positive in this endeavor, right? I think the idea that we likely will support stablecoins with tbDEX, with the belief that stablecoin to Bitcoin exchange may actually be far preferable to and safer than having to expose, say, a node on the tbDEX network to the pricing risk associated with exchanging directly to Bitcoin. So that's something that we're looking at very carefully. And once again, I think that's just a nod towards the fact that we need to solve the problems that we have now. And so that's actually something that we're looking at very, very carefully. Because honestly, I want the adoption of tbDEX to be as easy for a participating financial institution as possible. And so it is very likely, I think, that most of the nodes will exchange dollars for stable coins. And, then the next step would be stablecoin for Bitcoin, as a way to sort of take advantage of actually you could do atomic swaps then. And I think that would be a good thing. Because I think we really want to focus very specifically on how do you get, value out of the fiat system and into the Bitcoin system in the way that's the most least frictionful as possible.
Yeah, that's another nod to what is right now. In emerging economies, it's undeniable. These end users want the non-volatility of stablecoins. They also want the upside volatility of Bitcoin, but they have very little savings that they need to protect from downside price risk, which is just a reality of how the people in these emerging economies interact with their money, or want to interact with their money. It's probably a better way to put it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and so let's get into it. So another tweet you tweeted out, I don't know if it was last week or in the last couple of weeks. I was stalking your Twitter earlier this morning. People, for some weird reason, we find ourselves at the end of 2021, heading into 2022, that decentralization is synonymous with blockchain technology. And you're making the argument no, it's not. We have BitTorrent, we have things like RSS, we have many other decentralized technologies that don't leverage a blockchain. You did mention in the white paper there is a node topography within tbDEX, and DIDs, obviously, there's an anchor into a blockchain at the end of the day. How are you guys creating this decentralized system, and how, if at all, is a blockchain involved?
So tbDEX is not a blockchain-based protocol. It's it's a messaging protocol, right? With a mechanism for discovering nodes in a decentralized way. And in a sense, it's a lot more like a BitTorrent than it is like a blockchain. And like I think that's correct, right? Like blockchains, I think, are really bad solutions for most things. Like it's actually like it's a slow, shitty, expensive database. It's what a blockchain is. And it seems to me that like a lot of people haven't gotten that message. Obviously, like obviously I think it's also simultaneously one of the most amazing technological inventions, but it's also like really bad at almost everything, except for what Bitcoin uses it for, right? Which is like, building, censorship resistance and security around the ledger. That's all it's good for, in my opinion. And I think that's sort of where the fatal conceit of a lot of this Web3 stuff is, right? Like it's almost like people haven't thought about it for more than 5 seconds. They just like
they see the dollar signs.
Yeah.
Yeah, no.
Sorry, I feel like I didn't fully answer your question. Can you?
No, well, I just want to dive into it. So, dive into like the node, like how in its current design, right? Because it's still an ongoing design process at tbDEX. Like, what is the current vision of how somebody would enter this network, both from the verified, or the financial institution, the PFI, and the end user who's putting an ask within this messaging protocol.
Yeah, I'm like trying to buy Bitcoin with tbDEX. Like, how does that look?
Yeah.
Yeah, sure. I can talk to you about how I think it'll work on day one, and how I think it'll work in year 2 and year 5. I think it will be very different at different sort of stages and maturations of the network. I will say, though, as it pertains to sort of the ideas around node discovery, right now our thought process is to really keep it simple initially. The idea is that, well, I mean, I can just step back. I mean, like the real inspiration that we took for how do you build, this network up in a decentralized way that sort of just takes into account the reality in which we live, was to really look at the way that that trust is managed on the internet today, using the public key infrastructure and certificate authorities. And the way that it works, I mean, for people who aren't really familiar with it, the way that you get that little lock icon when you go to a website is that every web browser you use has been preloaded with a list of certificate authorities by the browser vendor, Google, Microsoft, Mozilla, whoever it is. And they've said to the browser, trust these certificate authorities. If a certificate authority issued a certificate to this website, then you can trust they are who they say they are. And that's how it works, right? There's just a dictionary of certificate authorities, and that's local on every web browser. That's sort of pre-listed. And we said, that's as good as any way to like bootstrap this. And the wallet person making the wallet, that integrates with the tbDEX protocol, can include a list of DIDs of like verifiers that they trust to basically say a PFI is who they say they are. And we will obviously be a PFI ourselves to help catalyze the network, and we will happily work with anyone else who wants to. But at the end of the day, there's no central registry. It's really in the same way that it's up to a browser vendor to essentially include a preloaded trust store. We're sort of following that same model. We can't really think of a way to do it in a more pure way. Any other way just ultimately creates some form of centralization. So in a sense, we are putting a lot of responsibility on the implementers of wallets to put in a list of DIDs that they think that their users should trust.
Well,
that's sort of the key. That's sort of the key design there.
And then beyond that, if these wallets are open source, you could have users initiate PRs that say, hey, I think I like this PFI, I'd like it included in the list as well. So there's some open nature to that as well.
There's no central authority. Like you can, and there's nothing that says that, and also even in a web browser, right? You can add your own CA manually if people know how to do it. Sometimes you have to do that on corporate networks and stuff like that. And there's no reason why someone couldn't do that. There's no traffic cops anywhere saying you can't do business with this PFI or you should trust it. What we hope happens is the same thing that's happened with the web, which is that there will become sort of a kind of a collective trust that, right? Like we trust, there's these groups of entities on the internet. Some of them may be nonprofits, some of them may be for-profits. And the community says like, look, I trust this nonprofit, entity that maybe it's like whatever it is, like the Bitcoin Foundation, right? That says like, we trust these PFIs and so we think you should trust them too, or we revoke our trust. We think you should stop trusting this guy, and so we're really that's how we're doing it. We think that that's the most honest way to do it. It gives control to individuals and control to the sort of the wallet developers. The network doesn't impose that.
Okay, and so that's individual users and wallet developers deciding how they trust an institution on the other side of a trade, on the sell side of a trade. How does an institution establish trust or decide that they trust or don't trust an individual user?
Yeah, I mean, it's the same thing in reverse in a sense, but obviously there's no like list of users out there. So we're building on the decentralized identity scheme, and we have to kind of bring up this we live in reality point again, which is that if a company like Block, and we are a regulated financial services company, wants to exchange funds in exchange for an asset such as Bitcoin, we have certain regulatory requirements, right, around KYC, BSA, AML, OFAC, and a whole bunch of other acronyms. And so, we have to have a way to deal with that in a decentralized way. We actually think that DID and VC, even though I know there's a lot of people out there, and I know you probably have a lot of crypto anarchists and stuff that are throwing up in their mouth as we talk about KYC, I would say to those people that like, I would much rather have a self-sovereign identity system for which you can sort of attach voluntarily, credentials of trust to satisfy the KYC model than to continue in the centralized world that we are today, where you go into an ecosystem like a centralized exchange. You go through their KYC process. They essentially own your data. They can sell your data. One of the great things about this approach and saying like, we think we can still comply with the law while using this technology is that this technology gives you the ability to do things like zero knowledge proofs, where rather than saying like, hey, we necessarily have to hand over all of your personally identifiable information, we can actually get to a world where all a provider would have to do is build up a credence based on an individual's self-sovereign identity with the attestations of like, this person is above a certain age, this person has a credit score above this or whatever that, without even necessarily having to diverge that, but to be able to have these zero knowledge proofs that can attest to that in a way that's through mutually trusted third parties is actually a way, I think, to at least, I mean, not completely, I'm not going to argue this is like, some sort of anarcho-utopia, but it does actually go a lot of the way to shifting control of information back to individuals, even though I have to admit that like there still is the reality that people have to identify themselves to a regulated entity. But using this technology, we can actually reduce the surface area of that data exchange substantially. And we can actually create an account model that's more secure, less susceptible to fraud. Like, I mean, if you think about it like rationally, like, like how do we like do KYC today? We take a picture of our driver's license, a piece of plastic, and we basically upload it to a website. Like that's what we do. Like that's crazy. Like that's crazy that we think that's secure. And something like a self-sovereign identity with an attestation that says Mike has the state of California agrees that this DID is licensed to drive in the state of California is going to be a hell of a lot more secure than a picture of driver's license, and may, through zero knowledge proof, not even have to require the actual divulgence of the actual like driver's license information to establish the fact that I can drive, right? And so I think that this is just like a really like great step in the direction of shifting the power balance in the account model back to the individual. And so the tbDEX protocol is saying that's how we're going to do it. Individuals in a wallet. Yeah.
In practice, right? In practice, like right now we are like, I sign up for Cash App, I give Cash App all my personal information. I sign up for Coinbase and I go give them all my personal information. Kraken, give them all my personal information. Bank of America, give them all my personal information. In practice, what this looks like is like a single KYC trusted provider that is taking all your personal information and then basically attesting to all these providers that they have the information without giving the information to the provider. And then ultimately, I guess, like the individual states will be doing that. It was a hope.
I use driver's license not to suggest that we're trying to make this the government's job. I think in practice, I mean, it will be mostly all private actors. I think the way to think about it is, right, like you're trying to create a Venn diagram between the customer's, identity and the attestation of their identity and the surface area that a PFI trusts. So in practice, say yes. So in a sense, the user is responsible for KYCing themselves in a sense by going out, I don't know, to finding some company that does DID KYC, and they verify who you are, who you say that they are. They put you through the rigmarole, and then they issue you an attestation, a verifiable credential, and then you kind of go out and you find these PFIs that also trust the issuer of that VC and say, we both mutually trust that third party. So the fact that they KYC'd you is enough for me. Therefore, I will transact funds with you. That's kind of, and that's at least a far more. It's not completely decentralized. I'm not going to argue that, but it's a far more decentralized approach than we have today, and I think is a great step in the right direction to find a way to balance the fact that we have to comply with these laws, but we would still like the user to have a lot more control than they currently do.
Yeah.
And then, rather than like Cash App holding that information, I mean, ultimately, like the justification for something like KYC AML laws is to stop illicit activity,
which it doesn't.
We're not going to get into a debate right now about whether or not it does. But so if the U.S. government says we think this transaction is illicit activity, then basically in that scenario, you say, we have this attestation from KYC provider number 3. Go to KYC provider number 3, give them this verifiable proof, and then they can give you the personal information rather than having your personal information on a million different servers. It's on that one provider server.
Yeah. I mean, generally speaking, yeah.
Well, then that begs the question, though. If it is on this one server, does that just shift honeypot risk to this one repository of this information?
This doesn't eliminate honeypot risk. It just doesn't, right? Like, I mean, and it's like one of these things where, it's just the reality is that if we're going to do this, we have to find a way to comply with the law, and so we're making a bet on doing it in the way that we think is at least a lot better than where we are today. And look, I mean, one thing I would love to see with this technology, and this isn't where we are today, but I would like to see governments around the world that recognize the fact that, that there's significant issues with the way that we do KYC today that exposes people to the risks of identity theft and all of these extreme negative, consequences that happen when these companies get hacked or these, large credit bureaus get hacked. these are terrible, like terrible concentrated risks, asymmetric risks. We would love to see a technology like zero knowledge proof be able to be used in a sort of like a constellation of attestations of like, yes, I will verify that this person who holds this DID has a Cash App account. I will verify that the person with this DID I've transacted with and they never screwed me over. I will verify, that this DID that this person sold me products and they were good on it. Like it could like eBay could be, issue a credential that you were like you're an eBay seller that's done 1,000 successful sales. And like, I would love to see governments be more willing to accept that these sort of more opaque ways of like building up trust as a way to like manage risk in these systems would be a far better way that would reduce the risks of people's identity being stolen, give people a lot more control. And I think this is like the power of decentralized identity and verifiable credentials. And it's one that we're going to be investing in very heavily in the coming years because we just think that it would be a much better model than the one we have today.
Yeah. No, I can't. Matt, I know you said you don't want to go there, but I can't help but go there in my mind. Like, it sucks that we have to design these systems in these ways around these shitty laws that really do nothing to help the end user at the end of the day. Like, how much time are we wasting designing this architecture around laws that arguably shouldn't exist because they're completely ineffective? That's just the thought.
We make those arguments up on the hill. Trust me. Like, we are trying very hard to educate lawmakers and policymakers about how we agree with you, like that a lot of these policies are very ineffectual, and at best, to the degree that I would say that they may be helpful in some respect to the government's ambitions are always after the fact. It's like this information collected may help, solve a crime long after it's already occurred. It doesn't really stop it from occurring. And I think there is a way with like technology and self-sovereign identity to significantly reduce the risk at the front end and remove the argument that like we have to have this privacy compromising infrastructure to reduce this bad activity to the degree that we do today. And that's a very hard argument to make. People are very people sort of in traditional financial regulation are very distrustful of that, but it's something that like I'm personally championing.
Yeah, well, thank you for championing. It's not only that they're distrustful too; it's like it does provide a compliance moat as well. Like, especially if you have that infrastructure built out already, it's like it's just easier to keep complying because competitors can't come in and blah blah blah.
And bigger companies are more capable of complying. It's not as expensive for them percentage wise. But so this is why I said earlier. I think it obviously doesn't eliminate honeypot risk. But it significantly reduces it. We see it happen to plenty of people who enter the space. They go sign up for Coinbase, they sign up for Cash App, they sign up for Kraken, they sign up for BlockFi, they sign up for Lolly, they sign up for every service. They send them all their personal information. If it's just in one spot, it's significantly better than being in 8 spots. But this is why I said, like, ultimately, if we are going to have a KYC AML regime, I don't know how much we can count on it, and you definitely shouldn't build tbD to expect it. But if governments actually came around and they're already holding the honeypot, the government already has the honeypot information. That's literally what they do, is just take all of our information all the time. If you didn't have to have that third-party company hold it in the first place because the government said, this person's a citizen, here's a string of letters and numbers that proves it. And now, you have your due diligence that you need to have there, and this is a trusted individual or whatever, then you don't have that even additional honeypot, right? Then you just have, it's like reducing honeypots along the way.
Yeah. I think that not to sound like I'm not responding to your point, but one of the things that I feel like I have to say is that, all these conversations, right, around trustlessness, like, centralization, censorship resistance, all these like sort of like principles and like sort of these things that we're trying to, like, we want to kind of be axiomatically true about these systems, but can't quite get there. I actually think is like sometimes a bit of a distraction from what I think is a more important value that I think is maybe the most powerful one that I think that I try to really focus on to really help ground me in how to like develop these solutions. And it's the maximization of choice. Not necessarily the maximization of like any of these other things, but the maximization that an individual should have the power to choose. The individual should have the power to choose to trust the PFI, to trust the software that they're using, to trust the people who are sort of provisioning the verification of their identity. And more broadly speaking, in this like sort of like, larger conversation we have, the right to choose whether they want to trust, dollars or not, or Bitcoin or not, or whatever it is, right? And really thinking about the system design through the maximization of choice and thinking about it through that lens. And that's kind of like how I clarify to myself the trade-offs that I'm making, right? Like, I think decentralization is like a really important principle that I think is important to maximizing choice for like epistemic reasons. But like, I do think that choice is kind of in my mind, is like the North Star.
Yeah. Optionality. We're always looking to expand optionality here at TFTC. We don't need to get too deep into the weeds here. We only have 7 minutes left, and I just have a nagging question that I had coming into this after reading the white paper that I want to make sure I get in before we wrap up here. But do you see tbDEX?
I could go all day.
I know. We could too. Well, do you see tbDEX as a transitionary tool? Right?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think in some respects it is, and I think in some respects it's not. I'm glad you asked me this question because, and it actually really parlays to the point that I was like trying to make earlier. Maybe I can like pull it all together. I am going to say something that might be very controversial to a lot of people, right? I don't think that anonymity is universally a good thing, right? And I don't think that anonymous financial transactions are universally a good thing. And that will shock a lot of people because then what immediately comes into their mind is like, well, he's basically saying that like he supports financial surveillance. That's actually not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that like we are the purpose of money, of payments, of the communication that we're having right now is to like accomplish ultimately social ends, right? Like, economic acts are social acts. And I think even if we had a completely anarchist society, an anarcho-capitalist society, in sort of the bent of Rothbard, which I've established I'm not a fan of, but like let's put that like on the table for a second. I still don't think you would want purely anonymous transactions across the board. And it's not hard to like imagine why, right? Like, would you really go on an anonymous website that you have no idea who owns it? You have no ability to evaluate whether the person who owns that website has any sort of reputation whatsoever to perform a service or to provide a good. Would you really do an anonymous transaction and say, I'm going to buy a teddy bear from an anonymous person on the other side of the world who I can't speak to, I have no phone number, there's no means of contact, there's no way in which to basically evaluate whether or not I have any reason to believe this teddy bear will actually show up once I send this completely non-reversible financial transaction to them. And like the second you realize that, you recognize that there is a place in which we always have to have means of establishing social trust for me to basically know you are who you say you are, not because like doing so is in service of making it easy for a state or some other like powerful entity to surveil us. I think that's a completely separate issue. I think privacy is something that we should be striving for. Financial privacy and financial anonymity to me are completely different things. Like anonymous financial transactions are transactions that have maximum risk because no party knows if the other one's going to screw the other one over. And so I don't think we actually want 100% anonymous transactions in the sort of like when we're engaging in economic transactions in the social realm. That just doesn't make any sense.
Would you?
And I know that like.
Would you separate anonymity and pseudonymity? Right, like so could a pseudonymous individual building up a web of trust credit score, if you will, you'd be fine interacting with them? Like Silk Road being a perfect example.
I would say that. I mean, pseudonymity to me is not an anonymity, right? Like we've already seen that. Like we've already seen that. Like this idea that I mean, anyone who's been in information technology for long enough knows that obscurity is not security, and so I would say that that the pseudonymity is pretty illusory. But I want to say something very clear. I am not in support of financial surveillance. I think we should have systems that cannot be surveilled by third parties arbitrarily. Like that's I think that we should have ways to do secure point-to-point transactions, like secure point. I use Signal, right, as my instant messaging app. It's not anonymous in the sense that the person on the other side of that transaction, on the other side of that communication, doesn't know who I am. Of course they do. In fact, if you're using Signal correctly, stood beside each other and we scanned each other's QR codes at some point to verify we are who we are. What we're optimizing for is privacy, and I think we should optimize for that, right? And tbDEX is focused on trying to optimize for privacy to the maximum extent we can within the constraints that we have. But anonymous financial transactions are definitely not the goal, and I just want to say that. And I know that
the key. I mean, let me see if I can distill this a little bit, Mike. The key here, right, is that we talked about options, people having optionality. The protocol is basically agnostic to individual actors' options in that situation, right? And there's going to be basically actors of different requirements and different necessities that are basically going to be a bunch of different shades of gray along the scale of what kind of web of trust, what kind of social trust they want to have with the people they transact with, and open up those options to whatever. So it doesn't really matter what Mike thinks a transaction should, how much social trust you should have in the other actor when you're doing a transaction, because tbD will allow all these different types of actors to basically come together and have a consensus on how much trust they want, right?
That's absolutely right, right?
Yeah.
Both sides of the transaction get to set their standards of trust. Right. And they have to achieve an overlap in order to create a market.
Yeah.
For a transaction. That's ultimately the kind of the central game theory, if you will.
Yeah, you said this gray area, man. It goes all the way from white to black on the spectrum, if you will, right. Potentially. And that middle area is somewhat gray.
But the reason why I had that spiel before is you asked me if this is a transitional technology, and what I'm actually saying is I think there is a world where tbDEX could be useful even crypto to crypto transactions, where it's desirable that both sides and it doesn't necessarily have to be KYC. I came up with other examples around sort of how do you establish trust, like your eBay score or something like that as an input into this as an attestation. But for there to be models where I will send you 1 Bitcoin for this used Ferrari that I want or whatever it is, but I also want to trust that you are who you say you are and you're actually going to send me the Ferrari. I think that tbDEX can be extremely beneficial, even in that world where you can essentially create common webs of trust in the social realm to overlay onto these purely crypto transactions. And I think tbDEX could very much be a valid solution in that context too, long term, even long after people stop using it as a fiat on-ramp.
Hell yeah. I'd love to hear that. I would love to get together in person over beers, talk philosophy, tbDEX, expand on this conversation. It's been an incredible conversation. Matt, do you have anything you want to get in here before we wrap up?
I just wanted to thank you for your time, Mike. I know you're, one of the unsung heroes working in the background at Block to make Bitcoin the standard. And I just wanted to tell you, I appreciate you and I appreciate your time.
Yeah. Thank you for having me. I'll do anytime. This is super fun.
Yeah, this is an incredible conversation. I want to co-sign what Matt just said. Thank you for all the work that you've done. I'm excited to see tbDEX come to market. Good luck building that out. Seems like you've got the team in place. Where can we find out more about what you're building? Can anybody or how people can contribute if they want to, and what you guys may need right now?
Yeah, you can find us on our unfortunately very hard to remember Twitter account. You can follow us at tbD 545669775. You can also find us at GitHub at that same sequence of letters and numbers. So and
are you going to change that ever?
No.
tbD?
No.
Some people have memorized Z-Man's handle. If they can remember that, I think they can remember TBD.
I dig it.
546559775. Mike, thank you for your time. I hope you have a great rest of your day. End of your year. End of your
Happy
days.
New Year.
Happy New Year to you as well. Happy New Year, you freaks listening to this. Peace and love.